Hello, everybody. I'm Weston LaBar, host of On the Waterfront podcast, brought to you by Waterfront Logistics. I'm here today with Matt Priest, CEO of the Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America. How are you doing today, Matt?
Hey, Weston, I'm doing well, man. Thanks for the opportunity to come on and chop it up with you on trade and supply chain and tariffs. Oh my, right? So I'm looking forward to it.
There's always an oh my in our industry, and it's always good to
There
have
is.
you on because you represent such a big constituency of importers and exporters. Talk a little bit about FDRA, your membership, and then we'll hop into some of the big issues that you guys are tackling right now.
Yeah, so we're an 81-year-old organization founded in 1944. Neither of the two of us were around at that moment in time, but fast forward to 2025, we represent 97% of the industry, of footwear companies in particular. So Nike and Adidas and Under Armour and Shoe Carnival and DSW and Steve Madden and Michael Kors, Walmart, Target. I mean, if you could think of a company that sells shoes in this country, more likely than not, we represent them. And I've been in this role since 2009, so I've been doing this for quite some time. And our goal is to make our footwear companies more competitive. And we're an importing industry. 99% of shoes sold in the U.S. are imported. So with that kind of import penetration, we need a robust trade association doing all the hard work to really bring together the industry on these issues of mutual and critical concern. And so many of which we'll talk about today. But it's an honor to be in this job. I'm only the third chief executive in 81 years. So once you get this job, it's like Hotel California. You can never check out. And in all honesty, I really don't want to. So I'm having a great time and get to hang out with guys like you. So what could be better?
And I wear footwear multiple times a day from multiple members of yours on any given day, right? So
Good.
we definitely want to have somebody out there fighting for the folks that are bringing, manufacturing these goods, bringing them into the country, getting them on our feet. Um, because I don't know where I'd be without footwear, right? It's a critical part of what we do every day, and I always have
It
to make
is.
sure it matches what I'm wearing. I'm weird like that, so.
That is critical,
Talk
though.
talk a little bit. So one of the big misnomers I feel like in general is people that go, "Oh, well, you got hundreds of pairs of shoes or thousands of pairs of shoes in a container, and when the price goes up, it really doesn't impact the consumer." I think you would probably argue that's not the situation. And right now, obviously, with tariffs being a huge topic in the global trade and supply chain arena, it really does have a big impact to your membership, right? Talk a little bit about tariffs. The FDRA has been front and center recently. Saw you quoted on ESPN. That's fantastic. I love ESPN. Maybe one day I'll be able to say, "Hey, Matt, I'm a ESPN alumni as well." But probably the coolest thing I've heard in a while. But talk about it. I mean, that's how important this is, though. When you talk about footwear, you even have, major sports media outlets like ESPN covering this issue because obviously they have a big base of folks that want to know about what's going to happen with their Jordan sneakers, right? Or what's going to happen with their favorite pair of kicks. You can't jump, man, without the Jordans, right?
That's right. No, it's a really good question, and we've been all over the place. Someone recently called us omnipresent. I was like, "Whoa, that sounds like biblical." I
Santa
was pretty
Claus.
blown away by that. So, I will say that I have a liberal arts degree, so I'm not a mathematician by trade, but I can tell you that as you increase costs for good at the border of our country, that's going to drive up the cost that's passed on to the consumer. And you can look at the consumer price index for footwear, Weston, and you compare that to the trends of both cost increases and decreases at the border. The FOB price, as your viewers, I'm sure, are well aware of that term. There's an unmistakable correlation between as prices go up or come down at the border, you're going to see a rise, an increase or a decrease in pricing for consumers. And the interesting thing is, we've done a ton of surveying in this political era we're in. We've asked a lot of Trump supporters how they feel about tariffs, who pays the tariffs, what does it do for pricing, and I'm happy to report that everyone gets it. They understand that a vast majority of even Republicans, when they're polled, understand that prices go up because of tariffs. Some are willing to do it, right? Some have see it as a patriotic duty, but the point is that these actions that we are navigating right now are inflationary, and we know the president was committed to pushing down prices. And so this does the exact opposite, but it's impacting everything. And it's not just footwear, it's across the board when you have such broad-based tariffs. And the U.S., the U.S. government, the American culture, and people do this about every 100 years. We're actually victims of one about 100 years ago. So we were part of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Those were the original tariffs on footwear that were put in place. And up until now, we've been paying exorbitant tariffs. And so we're at close to $4 billion a year in tariffs alone on a product that has 99% import penetration. We're kind of the poster child of an industry that had high tariffs. There were production jobs here and they moved overseas, or for most of our athletic companies, they started overseas at the outset in the 70s. And so that, we're kind of the canary in the coal mine as we warn people about the fact that these actions historically inevitably drive up prices for consumers, and that decreases sales. It's supply and demand, it's costing versus opportunity to access products. So we're in a really strange time where we're having to talk about this pretty consistently. So much so, as you mentioned, even ESPN.com is interested, and it was fun to be a part of that conversation, even if it's in some challenging times.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because this is now the second Trump administration, right? And the first time he had very specific tariffs that he wanted to levy based on certain types of products and goods and certain countries, China obviously being at the forefront of that. And how did people react? Some people felt like they had some elasticity on their pricing and they were able to continue to bring things in direct from China. Other folks augmented their supply chains, sending things to Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, etc. Talk a little bit about, I'm sure with your diverse membership, it's a little bit all over the map. I'm sure you have members that already have operations set up in places obviously outside of China. As you mentioned, your members are almost the originals, the OG when it comes to manufacturing in China and figuring out how to create some of these supply chains that we all look at as just part of our existence today. So what has the response from your members been? Because I think they've had the benefit of seeing some of the playbooks that folks from solar and steel and other types of commodities took at the end of 2018. But what are your members looking at as far as how they're starting to look at the supply chain and the diversification of it in the wake of the tariffs at this point in time?
Yeah, so diversification is something that's been a priority for us for a long time. It's actually hard to do in footwear, and there's a reason because it is highly labor intensive. And so if you look at our vast majority of our footwear that comes into the US is just from three countries. When I started in 2009, China represented as our number one supplier. It's still our number one supplier, spoiler alert, but in 2009, it was 88% of our volume of all footwear sold in the US, and it was 76% of our value. We decided in 2009, 2010, based on trails that were being blazed by athletic footwear companies in particular, that we need to start diversify, move towards places like Vietnam and into Indonesia. And the reason why it was all market driven, it was lack of labor and lack of labor interest in China as it relates to those who wanted to make footwear, right? And so there's a lot of things that happen when you look at a country, and we have a lot of experiences in industry from a sourcing perspective. And I'll get to the 2024 numbers in just a second. But in general, you'll see that toys is one of the first thing industry that pops up in a developing country for production purposes. Soon thereafter, it's apparel, and then footwear after that. Footwear is more labor intensive. Once you start to see then automobiles, high tech, and then a McDonald's shows up, you're kind of on borrowed time from a developing perspective relative to are you going to continue to work with this country from a sourcing perspective, right? And so in 2024, we look at those same numbers. China is now 56% of our volume, not 88%, and it's 35% of our value, not 76%. So there's still some companies sourcing from China, and ironically, it's those companies that meet working families' most basic needs in price sensitive and price competitive marketplaces. They're the ones who are taking the brunt of this, and so even there's a kid's plastic shoe that now has a 95% duty on it coming out of China because of the Trump administration. So they are going to be charging more for products for working families in particular. But the broader point is that as we think about, okay, if more and more tariffs take effect, where are we going to go? We're going to continue to kind of look for opportunities in Vietnam. We're going to continue to look for opportunities in Indonesia. But the Trump administration is focused in on trade deficits, and we can talk about the utility of that if you want. But you got to think through, like, they basically have said, look, if you're a G20 country, or the dirty 15, they're now calling it, and you have a trade deficit, you're in trouble. Well, then if you look at our top 10 suppliers, growing exponentially at number four is Cambodia, and Bangladesh is number 10, and they're growing. So those are two countries in the region that have some footwear production capabilities, Cambodia more than Bangladesh, that are outside of the target area that the Trump administration has placed upon trading partners. And so that's, I think, where you'll start to see a little bit more tire kicking from our industry in those markets to see what the capabilities are and what access to raw materials, capacity, labor, to see if we can start to make moves into those countries. If not, you're going to get hit with tariffs one way or the other. And so I think that's one of the challenging aspects of where our industry is right now.
Well, Jim Rip Sur from Cambodia. It sounds like we need to polish up on our Khmer because that's where our shoes will be coming from. But you know,
Quite
what
possible.
really your comments? I fun fact. I just stepped down, but I spent 12 years as chair of the United Cambodian Communities Board of Directors here in the city of Long Beach. So,
Really?
Long Beach has the largest population of Cambodians outside of Phnom Penh. So
Really?
concentrated in one area. Yeah. So
Wow.
we'll get into that at a different point in time. But if you need some folks
Who
that
knew,
know how to
man? You're a
navigate
Renaissance man.
Cambodia, as I told a reporter one time, I consider myself multicultural. So nonetheless, your comments spark two thoughts. One is that the first time around, everything in 2018 was focused on China. This time there's a lot of tariffs that are focused outside of China, whether it be on the borders here in the US with Canada and Mexico for different reasons, whether it be other countries, as you said, part of the G20 or the Dirty 15, and where there's trade deficits. So that changes a little bit of how you change your business practices if you are looking to diversify your supply chain, right? Because if you're saying all I need to do is avoid China, well, there's a whole host of ways to do that. If you're looking at it and saying, I need to move some things out of China, but I also need to make sure that it's not on a target list of a potential future tariff, that's a lot more difficult to navigate. Talk a little bit about that because my guess is for some folks, you kind of have to wait and see where things filter out. Otherwise, you may set up shop someplace only to be tariffed 18, 24 months from now.
Great question. And we have to remind our members all the time, Weston, that these tariff actions don't happen in a vacuum. So clearly, the tariffs added to China, and there were two rounds of them, an additional 20% under the IEPA law around fentanyl, of all things, for China. That has obviously driven up prices, create a lot of uncertainty on the pricing side of things as relate to how our members are talking to their suppliers for it. But if you run to Vietnam, let's say you pivoted to our number two supplier in Vietnam, and you run over there, they know it. Demand goes up. A lot of sectors are moving to Vietnam, and so that's you're not going to go and get 20% savings because you kind of pivoted over to Vietnam, and so that's what our members have to understand. And so that wait and see approach is probably the best option at this point of basically a slew of really bad options, because you're right, they're focused in on creating they've given us three different, I think maybe four different excuses as to why we're doing this because no one voted for this, no one wanted it, no one's asking for it. Companies aren't really asking for it. Voters aren't really asking for it. The economy is clearly not asking for it, as we've seen in the market lately. But it was fentanyl, the flow of fentanyl. We got to stop that. The flow of immigration, we got to stop that. So tariffs will do that as well. Oh, by the way, we're going to raise a ton of money from it. So we're going to raise money. It's going to help with the tax cuts. Oh, and by the way, it'll help prop up domestic manufacturing and encourage the flow of investment. Well, the problem is if you stem the flow of imports, then you stem the flow of revenue to the U.S. government. Therefore, that argument goes away. I will say they've done an effective job of tying it to the fentanyl crisis. I get a lot of, anytime I'm on TV, I get a lot of feedback from people who are upset with me, thinking that if we just tax Americans more on their shoes, that fentanyl will stop flowing in the board across our borders. So
Makes
they've
sense.
done that right, but you don't know where they're landing, and so they did start. I will say they started out that they were going to lower prices on day one. That was their messaging. And our leading up to the inauguration, Weston, our sales numbers were actually really robust. There was a lot of excitement about a second Trump term from the broad consumer base. They thought, oh, I remember when the president was in office last time, the economy was awesome. So they were excited about it. Our sales were up, we keep internal sales numbers. They were up 13, 14% in the 4 weeks leading up to the inauguration. In the 7 to 8 weeks since, they're down 14%. And it's like a light switch was flipped, and it was flipped by the president, all this uncertainty. And so that's where we kind of find ourselves because now their messaging is, oh, it's going to be painful, it's going to be inflationary, and it's going to be transitory, though. That phrase has been brought back up. So they're grasping at some kind of rationale that flies with the American people, and they can't find it because they're basically self-imposing a recession as quickly as they can. Is what it feels like. So anyway, all of our members are. It's a very uncertain time. Consumers like certainty, companies like certainty, and hopefully we get it soon. But because of that, we're not pivoting to countries that's really quickly out of the gate.
And that you set me up for another great segue. The Trump administration, the first time in office, was looked at as very business friendly, right? And I get that typically when a Republican goes into office, there's just a feeling they're going to be business friendly. Democrat goes in office, and there's a feel like, okay, well, there's a more environmental regulation, more labor regulation, different things. I feel like people don't have that same sense of confidence right now. And one of the other options you have is you talked about it, repatriate manufacturing and make it domestic. Well, I would say the first challenge you have is that the infrastructure, the workforce, all of that is not here and ready in a turnkey solution to pick up. And if you even wanted to move all your manufacturing to the US, it's not ready for it. And so if you want to look at tariffs and look at how you can accomplish some of these things like bringing industry back to the US, you have to have a longer term plan. I mean, look what happened with chassis, right? No chassis came into the country, and guess what? We had a meltdown, which was the cause and effect of not having a phased in tariff with a plan on how you were going to recreate American manufacturing. But the bigger issue is that the American manufacturers themselves use Chinese componentry, and they were tariffed, and they were impossible to get a hold of. So, talk a little bit about, because when it comes to shoes, obviously you've got a lot of raw materials that are getting transformed into the materials, whether it's leather, whether it's rubber, whether it's some sort of other textile. What correlation does that have with the footwear industry? Are they sourcing these materials from all over the country? Is there a potential exposure to try to bring in, like, if I wanted to manufacture in the U.S. and I had the workers and I had the equipment and I had the facilities, what are some of the unintended consequences they'd be dealing with from a sourcing perspective?
Yeah, we've had a lot of interest for obvious reasons because of the policies that have been pushed forward about both from the media and the industry. What about domestic production? What can we do here? And just to give the viewers context, right? We imported about 2 to 2.5 billion pairs of shoes every year. That's over 7 pairs of shoes for every man, woman, and child in this country every single year. And and it's a very steady number, we make about 25 million pair a year domestically. Some of that's for military application, the Berry Amendment, government contracting, those kinds of things. And so it's a very small portion of what we do. Could we get to a point where we can produce domestically most of the shoes needed for the American consumer? And the answer to that is definitely not. I mean, the challenge is, Weston, is that there's the political fun thing to say, convenient thing to say, and there's like actual reality, right? And most of my comments, I don't want anyone to misconstrue. I I absolutely am grateful for domestic producers. Some really great companies producing domestically. You got Keene in Portland, Danner in Portland. You got H Brown in Pennsylvania. You got Schloop down in Mississippi. New Balance up in New England. So there's some really good company. Allen Edmonds in Wisconsin. Great companies producing here domestically. But all of those companies I mentioned, except one, also import. And they know, and they import a vast majority of what they sell because they know they're making just special types of runs and product here in the states, and you have to bring in materials and components to accomplish that. The administration's been interesting because they have a certain rhetoric they're trying to accomplish, but if you look at the details of the policy, it doesn't do what the rhetoric says they want to do. So, for example, when you look at footwear parts and components and materials to come into this country, because we don't have it here. We would need like an immaculate conception, basically, of product immediately and materials immediately for this to work. So we got to bring in parts, and all those companies I mentioned do that, and they assemble parts from Chinese origin in some cases. Well, now those parts have a 27.5% duty on them because of these tariff actions. And so they're not looking to even encourage the importation of parts to prop up domestic production. And that's a problem not just with footwear. I've heard about it across many different sectors for manufacturers here in the States, particularly when you look at the USMCA and totally deconstructing that with additional tariffs on things like automobiles. And so the challenge for us is that, you know what, the dirty little secret is that we make more in the United States than we've ever made in our history. You wouldn't believe it based on the rhetoric, but we make it with way less people, way higher value, and we make it for export and for internal purposes as well. But that doesn't play well politically, right? And that doesn't play well in the Rust Belt. And I think whatever is repatriated here or is conceived here and propped up from a footwear perspective, Weston, will be with a lot less people. It will have to be with robotics and technology, and that's great, but that's not the big job enhancing thing. We've matured out of it. China wants to mature out of footwear production. They want to pass it off to other countries. But we always, politically, we always try to go back and try to revert back to an era where we made everything. And is the American workforce interested in doing this? That's the question I have rhetorically, but it's hard to know.
Well, it's funny because I've said for a long time, if you really look at it, logistics is the modern day manufacturing, right? Logistics creates a lot of jobs, and whether you're
Yeah,
building a sneaker here and putting it together, or you're importing it from China, the materials need to. It's not like they're growing rubber tree plants outside of the facility that they're stitching all the shoes together, right? So on one
right.
front, you have to source materials outside of the US, which if those have tariffs on them, you're going to drive the cost up because it can't be 100% made in the US, right? And then to your point, you could be replacing jobs at seaports, with trucking companies and transload facilities throughout the US for the folks that are moving not just the product around, but the components and the raw materials that go in and out of these. Um, Manufacturing hubs or assemblance hubs for the stuff that is made in the US. But those facilities, unless they've been operating forever, are to your point, mostly automated. And so, are we replacing American jobs to create these big manufacturing centers that have no jobs in them? Is I think part of what needs to be figured out as well. We're just we're in that fourth phase of the industrial revolution, and because of
Hmm.
that, we need to think differently than when we were in the third or the second phase of it, which I think a lot of people forget. Um, Taking it
Great
to the
point.
next step, because it's not just tariffs, right? As we start to talk about things that the American people don't realize, Chinese ships. Obviously, this is an executive order that's in draft form, and everybody's waiting to see how it all sort of shakes out. By the time our listeners hear this and viewers watch it, we may have a little bit of an idea of what's going to be happening and what the timetable looks like. But um, you know, over 90% of the ships in the world were built in China. They've grown from what was it in 1990, they had about 5% of the shipbuilding capacity to today. They're like I said, in some cases 90+% of what you see in the market. You've got these major global ocean carriers with big ship orders, and guess what? We don't have the steel production here, nor do we have the shipbuilding facilities and skilled workforce that we once had. So the commentary about a fee for a wharfing fee essentially, or a docking fee for Chinese built ships, that's just additional cost, right? There's no way around it. And what does that do to your members? I've talked about on a couple interviews, I've talked about you'll see increased costs, but you'll also see less routing choice. So it'll change the way the domestic supply chain works. Instead of having a ship that goes to LA and then Oakland and then Seattle, it'll probably only go to LA. And so now you'll have to figure out how to truck it or rail it from LA someplace else. You also have potential job loss because if you have a seaport that no longer has ships coming in and out of it, probably don't need the landside infrastructure here domestically in the US to support it. Talk a little bit about that because to me that's more straightforward with less of a solution than the tariffs.
Yeah, I agree, and it's kind of a Trojan horse in a bit because we know even during the campaign that the president was focused in on tariff policy, tariff policy, tariff policy. That was something we could see coming a mile away. This one was interesting because it was launched by the Biden administration, so it didn't originate with President Trump and his team. And so there's kind of dual, we can assign blame to both, I think, both parties on this one. While at the same time, the remedy is quite extreme. It's being proposed a $1.5 million charge per Chinese vessel per call. And I can say that this has been one of all the things that our members are concerned about, this one has surprised me because some are more concerned about this than a 10% tariff on Chinese goods or 20% tariff on Chinese goods, because they see it as that fundamental to our competitiveness, the ability to move product, many of the things you just mentioned, jobs, waterside jobs on all these, or waterfront jobs, I should say, on all these markets you just mentioned, all these ports you just mentioned. And so it kind of caught me by surprise just based on the concern of our members. And so I think there was a hearing and public comments. We're filing public comments actually today. And so we're a big part of it. We signed a letter with the NRF. I think there's 300 and something organizations on it. So this has got a lot of people concerned. And I will say the president is focused in on this from a dual front perspective. One is he wants to, both on the shipbuilding side of things, have a really robust policy for both the U.S. military and for commercial application. And so he views this as I think, as a really foundational part of having a more industrialized nation. And that's what his focus is on. So much so, they have an office of shipbuilding now in the White House. And so it's a key
Thought
component
they
of
were
his
getting
policy.
rid of offices.
Yeah, they're adding on. Apparently, definitely not getting rid of NASA for Doge purposes. That would be counterintuitive to SpaceX. But at the same time, also they're propping up some really key offices, and that's a sign that it's a priority for him. So we'll see what they come down to, and if they dial it back a little bit. But and again, in his mind, it allows the U.S. government to create an environment to build more ships and to encourage that. And he thinks tariffs are the magical elixir that solves all of our economic, geopolitical, and political problems. So,
Yeah, I think it's I think there's a lot of merit to looking how we can bring things back to the US that we've lost where it makes sense. My biggest fear is if you don't have a well thought out plan and timeline where you can see if we take these steps in the next decade or decades, we'll be able to bring these back and we'll be able to have this as a manufacturing center. All you're doing is adding cost to an already inflationary state because the supply chain, if it gets more expensive, and we've said this, whether it's environmental measures that create zero emission truck mandates, whether it's labor mandates that just increase the cost or take away the flexibility of being able to use the right type of labor in the right instances when it's needed. Everything that we look at creates cost, right? And at the end of the day, at a certain point in time, it gets passed down to the consumer. And so, while I think that there's a lot of merit in the concept, right, on surface value, it's really the execution. Most of these things are about execution, right? And so, can we get there? Who knows? But we definitely, if we don't have the plan to get there, just putting a fee in place isn't going to help the situation. So
agreed.
we'll see where that one goes, but I think it's that one's a tougher one, right? To try to figure a workaround or to build it into your cost because and it will have a catastrophic event. on or impact, I should say, I think, on the way that our supply chains work here in the US, because you'll probably see the need of less seaports. You'll probably
Right.
see less ports of call. You're going to see more congestion at the first port of call because it'll be the only port of call. And much like you
Mhm.
see in LA Long Beach, where 80 to 100% of a ship dumps out, imagine on the East Coast where you'll see maybe, 10 or 20% of the ship get offloaded and then they'll reload a little bit and they'll go up and down the coast. Imagine if all that just dumps in a port like Savannah or Charleston or New York, New Jersey. You're going to be dealing with a lot more congestion. It's going to look a lot more like it does in LA Long Beach during peak season. So I think these are things that, hopefully they're engaging Federal Maritime Commission and other trade related organizations that can take a look at, okay, do we have what we need in those locations to support a potential augmentation of multiple ports of call to one single port of call when ships are coming in and out of the U.S. Really appreciated your time today. Let's pivot a little bit, talk about something a little bit more exciting and friendly. Talk about FDRA. I mean, you guys are doing such great work, not just on behalf of your members, but on behalf of companies like us, Waterfront Logistics, who support your members, on behalf of anybody who's an importer or an exporter who is subject to these tariffs and other policy measures. So for folks that are not a member, and I highly recommend if you're not a member of the FDRA and you're an importer, especially in footwear, that you get engaged. But Matt, talk about FDRA and talk about how folks can get engaged because you guys do so much on the educational front, on the advocacy front, bringing people together. Give people a little bit of an idea of some of the benefits of FDRA.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, Weston. I mean, for us, again, 81-year-old organization, but we've never had more growth and relevance than we've had in the last 3 or 4 years. It's because we are providing service that is invaluable and critical to our members' success. A while ago, I would say 8 or 9 years ago, internally, we thought as a team, a lot of us have backgrounds in government and presidential administrations and lobbying and advocacy. That's what we will always do. That's our core competency. But but we can't just assign the brand of FDRA to the success or failure of what Congress does in any given year because the ceiling of the Congress's approval rating is like 15%. And so we thought to ourselves, what other value added resources can we drive to the industry that's going to be helpful? And so we do a ton of data services, both corporate data published internal for our members, sales data, import data, costing data, inventory data, all those types of things. We also do a lot of one-offs. So we basically have a research team on call for our members as they're heading into a critical board meeting or a really vital sales meeting that's coming up. We build slides, we brief, we do all these kinds of things. We're a full concierge service for the industry, and we pride ourselves in that. And a lot of us worked on Capitol Hill in constituent services, right? Our bosses had constituencies that we had to address and to support and meet their needs. And that's how we view the industry. It's an honor and privilege to serve a $120 billion annual industry just here in the States. And all the brands that you and I grew up knowing and loving and just dreaming that we could someday sport while, dunking a ball on a highlight on ESPN.com, although .com didn't exist when I was a kid. Now I don't get to do any of that, but I get to work with them in a business setting, and it's been the honor of a lifetime. So for me, there's no greater job than being, you know, the lobbying for kicks, as I like to say, or being a shoe lobbyist. It's been a lot of fun. And my hope is people can go to FDRA.org, check out all the things that we do. We have our own podcast, Shoe and Show. We have tons of different resources, events, etc. And if you need to get a hold of me, look me up on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with you there, and we can tell you more about it.
No, I really appreciate it. Like I said, you guys are leading the charge with the NRF and a few other organizations on this very important issue, and we really appreciate everything that you're doing. I can't turn on the news and have something tariff related without the input of you and or the National Retail Federation on these issues. And I think it's super important because, as you just talked about, some of the resources you provide, data is king and knowledge is power, and you guys are helping bridge the gap, providing data to create knowledge. And I think that's fantastic because so many of these issues are very complex. And oftentimes there isn't that easy surface level answer. And so being able to break it down and if people understand the real impacts of the decisions being made, to themselves, their everyday life, their pocketbook. These are things that we really need from a consumer perspective. And then your members, just like best practices, how do they adapt to some of these new rules that are put in place. That's just as important as helping advise the policymakers on the do's and don'ts of policymaking, right? And the
Right.
advocacy that you do. So really appreciate it and appreciate you coming on today. Any closing remarks you want for the audience?
Nah, these are critical times, Weston. These are really important times, and we've built a lot of wisdom. The supply chain professionals, guys like you and those you represent, and us and those that we represent, have really built up a lot of wisdom and knowledge and forethought because we've had to face a lot of stuff over the last 5 years, whether it be COVID related, pandemic related, inflation related, Houthi related, Panama Canal related. I mean, I could go on and on. And now additional tariff related that go with trust your gut. Like my encouragement to people is like, you've been here. This is your first rodeo. And you've had a lot of rodeos for the last 5 years, and you should just trust your gut on these things, and that will take you a long way. There's value in built up wisdom during challenging times, and iron sharpens iron. So these conversations are helpful for me, Weston. I hope they're helpful for your viewers. And again, I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining us. We're tackling yet another one of these once in a lifetime supply chain disruptions. Seems to have at least one a year, sometimes multiple. But again, Matt Priest, CEO of the Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America, really appreciate you joining us for On the Waterfront. I'm Weston LaBar. Thank you for joining us. This is another episode brought to you by Waterfront Logistics, and we'll see you next time.